Hello, and welcome to the Social Purpose Exchange. My name is Sean Mallon. Here's a proposition that is turning the business world on its head. An obsession with delivering profit for shareholders above all other considerations isn't necessarily such a great business model anymore. Customers, communities, employees, and even some shareholders are now demanding that corporations do better, that they make a real and meaningful contribution to improving society. That's social purpose. And the Social Purpose Exchange is a forum for what we hope will be provocative, enlightening conversations about this concept that is revolutionizing the business world. My guest is Martin Reeves. Mr. Reeves is the chairman of BCG Henderson Institute, which is the strategy think tank for the Boston Consulting Group, and a person who has a lot of thinking about the concept of social purpose. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Sean.
Let's just start with the basics. What's your definition of social purpose?
Well, the simplest definition is, why does a corporation exist? Not what does it do or how does it do what it's supposed to do, but why does it exist? And if you unpack that a little bit, it's essentially about the intersection of an aspiration, what the company can do, what the company wants to do, a social need, and also action, of course, not just a slogan, but something which is actioned.
Give me an idea how that plays out in the real world. Give me a case study of a good example of social purpose.
I think a very good example is CVS, the US pharmacy chain, who in 2014 decided that it wanted to be a healthcare company. But the inconvenient fact was that it was selling tobacco. That was a major source of profit. So the CEO at the time said, we either are a healthcare company and we're serious about it or we're not. So they created their purpose to help people on a better path to health. And they decided they needed to stop, therefore, selling tobacco. That was a pretty big hit. It was a $2 billion business. But by creating that clarification about why they existed, which guided what they did, they actually were more successful with their minute clinics. They bought one of the largest insurers in the US, Aetna, and actually, therefore, experienced a period of expansion.
So here's a case where a company stepped back from a real profit center, selling tobacco, took on this concept of social purpose as a greater social good, but ultimately it proved better for the bottom line?
Yes, and that's not an accident. So it goes right back to Aristotle, actually, if I could take a little detour. Aristotle had two concepts of economics. One was oikonomia, the affairs of the household, and the other was chromatistica, which is money grubbing, or the affairs of the marketplace. And his contention was that profit maximization as an end in itself blows up. It's not sustainable. Whereas profit maximization subject to some sort of social motive, namely the good of the family, was superior. Now, one of the interesting things that we've done in the Henderson Institute is we've actually analyzed the language of companies. Do they use the language of the affairs of the household or the language of profit maximization? And the interesting paradox is that companies that are adopting financial maximization as an end in itself actually do less well in the long term financially.
Why is that?
Well, I think it goes right back to sort of system science and biology, really. If you imagine you're an economic island and can extract from the environment without considering the health of the environment that you're extracting from, the social systems, the ecological systems you rely on, then ultimately it's not sustainable. You exhaust the system, or you get rejected by the system, or you lose your license to operate.
Is this a tough sell for CEOs? I mean, you've got a great case study there, but their purpose for existing is to deliver on those quarterly returns. And how do you convince them of this creative tension that might lead to a better long-term result? Is it hard to convince them?
I think 5-10 years ago it might have been a hard sell, especially in at the sort of bastions of capitalism in the Anglo-Saxon form, because as Milton Friedman stated, the business of business is business. It's the business of business to maximize profit and not to worry about these social issues, which are the remit of government, was the idea. But actually, it's not a hard sell now, because I think that it's fairly self-apparent to most CEOs that the externalities of doing business, the side effects of doing business, given the enormous presence it has now, the enormous footprint the business has, could ultimately spoil the game of business. In other words, if business does not address inequality, social warming, species depletion. It's not going to attract the top talent, and it's going to undermine its own business model. So I've just come back from Davos, and it was striking how the conversation there was dominated by planet and society. Whereas 2 years ago it was dominated by the promise of technology, a year ago it was all about fears of the global recession, but this year it was firmly about planet and society. And that's not just the official agenda, that's also the spontaneous side conversations too.
So it's interesting to hear that it's taking hold at a forum so prominent as Davos. But there's also a great deal of public suspicion of corporations, of CEOs, that perhaps they might be working for pernicious purposes, working behind the scenes to buy off politicians to get a favorable tax situation or the rest of it. How do you sell this to the general public, though, who might be suspicious of corporate motives?
Well, I think they are suspicious. There have been a number of articles, saying, stop the misappropriation of the word purpose. I think that was in Quartz, and so there is suspicion around corporate motives. So I think it's just a classic sort of trust problem, namely. Corporations will be judged not by their words, they may begin with words, but they'll be judged by their actions. So I think it's consistency across time. So in the CVS example I gave, clearly the corporate poetry was backed up with costly actions, expensive signals, and they did turn out to be both for the good of public health and for the good of the corporation. So we'll judge corporations by their actions.
So give me an example of the consequences for a company that doesn't embrace this concept of social purpose. What do they face, short-term, long-term?
Well, originally I was a biologist, and essentially what you get is an allergic reaction to the company. You can think about society as a series of sort of nested circles, and you've got corporations, and then you have corporations are embedded in economies, and they're embedded in societies, and that's embedded in ecology. And it's always a mistake to try to fight the system that you're embedded in, because you will lose. You'll lose your social license to operate, you'll be regulated, you'll be mistrusted. And the economists have something they call SCAR costs, the costs of search, contracting, auditing, and reconciliation. Those are the things that you do if you don't trust somebody, and they're extremely costly. If I have huge legal bills, if I have to advertise intensively to persuade you, the reluctant believer, that actually I'm a good person and you should buy my products, then it's very expensive to do business. That's what happens if you don't have a believed and executed purpose.
So it can be something catastrophic and short. A company has a tremendous scandal that effectively, if not wipes it out, really diminishes it. Or it could be a long-term kind of drip, drip, drip for a bad player that ultimately faces all these consequences.
Absolutely.
You talked about the CEO role. In an article you co-wrote, you spoke about increased pressure on business leaders, and you cited a 2018 survey of people in 28 countries, and I'm quoting this, about 80% of people said they expect CEOs to be personally visible in sharing the company's purpose, and around 75% want CEOs to discuss how their company benefits society. You've also written about the concept of corporate statesmanship. How much of the driver for this has to come from corporate leadership?
Well, I actually don't believe that corporations can solve the major planetary problems alone. There's certainly a role for governments. We need regulation to prevent free riding and to create standards and so on. And we also need the involvement of citizens. I mean, public opinion drives politics, and politics drives regulation. So we need engagement too. But nevertheless, if you think about what a corporation's good at, they're good at solving problems. They're extremely pragmatic problem-solving machines, and they have lots of resources. So it's a tremendous resource as we tackle these planetary problems. I think one of the rate-limiting steps is this mind switch, this switch in mindset, if you like, from managing the internal affairs of the corporation predominantly for maximizing shareholder wealth, which is value extraction, to this broader concept of shepherding the system upon which the profits rely and maintaining trust and social license to operate, which involves this idea of corporate statesmanship. Now, corporate statesmanship is very different from internal leadership, if you think about it. It's external, not internal. It's collaborative rather than competitive, and it relies on soft power rather than ownership and control. So that's, if you like, a strand of leadership that we see emerging right now.
How does a corporation begin this journey towards developing a social purpose? What kind of questions they need to ask themselves? Tell me a bit about the process.
Well, once you're ready to embark upon the process, I think the first step is discovering the purpose. And I think you can look for two places for that. I think you look in the roots of the corporation. Corporations usually start for a reason. And obviously, if that reason is not sanctioned by society, it doesn't work. So I like to think back, use P&G as an example. P&G now makes all sorts of things. But it started off the American Civil War to make soap and candles. Why? Because the founder wanted to bring light and cleanliness, the two things that were missing from the American Revolution. So an extremely clear purpose, very persuasive purpose. But of course, corporations diversify, they get lost in the complexity. So the first thing is to go back to the roots and discover why do we exist? Why did we exist? But of course, your reason for existing may have changed, so you also have to look at the social context. What do people expect of us? What are the major problems in the world? Where do our capabilities play? So that's step one, discovery. Then I think you have codification, which is you have to boil that down and say, well, all of this research we did, how would we express it in a powerful meme that would communicate to employees, to shareholders, to stakeholders, to the public? And that is harder work than you might think. Then I think you have to action it, and we call that activation. So basically, it's not something that you deliver to people. The employees have to be activated, have to be energized around the sense of purpose. You can't make people believe things, so that's quite a hard process. A lot of discussions and persuasion. There has to be involvement in the process. And then lastly, there's embedding, which is, if you stopped at stage 3, you'd end up with a very good communication exercise. But of course, your earlier question, will the public trust this? They'll trust it if they see consistent and coherent actions resulting from purpose. So 4 steps. That's if you're ready to embark upon purpose. But probably the preliminary thing that the top management has to engage on is, actually, what is purpose? And do we need one? That's a very important discussion, which is the trigger for these 4 steps.
And I think you've already made the persuasive argument about why they need it. You also write that to really matter, the pursuit of purpose should be deliberately uncomfortable.
Yes.
How so, and why is that important?
Well, concepts that are powerful, as they get popularized, often become trivialized. And I guess the dangerous trivialization of purpose here is that it is a slick corporate communication video that merely describes and celebrates what you currently do. If it is a mere description of the status quo, then there's really no point in doing it. There has to be a stretch. If you have an aspiration which is valuable to you competitively and valuable to society, it probably involves some degree of difficulty and some degree of discomfort. So for CVS, it was tobacco sales. But I think it's important that social purpose is uncomfortable. If it's not uncomfortable, you're not stretching towards an aspiration.
You quote in one of your articles as well, the world's oldest company, founded in 578, a Japanese construction firm called Kongo Gumi, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which describes its purpose this way: Kongo Gumi constructs shrines and temples that cultivate and bring calmness to the mind, which is an elegant and timeless statement. Why does that work?
That works because, so I must say that Kongo Gumi eventually went bankrupt because unfortunately the 40th generation owner speculated in the real estate market and therefore destroyed the heritage of the previous generations. But nevertheless, for a long time...
They still got a good 1,500 years or so.
But they got a good 1,500 years. So the reason that works is a clear identity, a clear relationship with society. It's clear what they do, and they do it. Also, they're picking a perennial aspect of society, that need for spirituality and calm. And that's what they did very well. They didn't say we maximize shareholder value. They didn't say we maximize profits in the next quarter. They said we take a timeless need of humanity, and we do that consistently, and we do that best.
How do we measure the success and veracity of social purpose? Because we talked about how people being suspicious about it, about companies just doing lip service. Is there a need, as this movement grows, as we hope it does, to measure its truth?
Well, I think there are good reasons why management is obsessed with metrics. They say what Drucker said, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, or what gets measured gets done. But however, I'd contend that we shouldn't restrict ourselves to things that are measurable if they're important. And I think social purpose is important. It's quite hard to measure, but I think you can measure it with a couple of surrogates. One of them is the longevity of the corporation. If you're in harmony with society and with ecology, then unlike the average corporation, which dies after 37 years, perhaps you have a chance to live 100 years or or 1,000 years, 1,500 years. Longevity. Another one is public opinion. Public opinion is fickle, but across time you can measure the number of supporters versus the number of detractors, the net trust quotient, and I think across time that will be consistent with purpose. But I think the biggest metric of purpose is the soft metric of consistency between actions and words. So usually a purpose is a very simple promise of what it is you stand for, and in your actions we can, I think using common sense, say, is that consistent with that purpose or not? And I think that's when it begins to be a source of trust, a source of stable identity.
Such as the pharmacy that stops selling cigarettes and promotes cessation programs.
Exactly. When they started to actually behave as if they were a healthcare company, and that was the most important guiding value. And the reason why this is, it's a very simple idea, but the reason why this is valuable is, if you think about the operational reality of a corporation, it's doing thousands of things, making thousands of decisions. If each decision had to be optimized individually against a goal, that would be very hard. So an overarching philosophy, an overarching yardstick that you measure consistency against is extraordinarily helpful.
We live in a disputatious age. You're based in the United States now, where politics has never been more tribal. People don't trust each other. People make value judgments about each other. People make value judgments about politicians, political leaders. Are you hopeful that in this environment, the concept of social purpose can really take hold and grow? And could it even be a kind of antidote to these negative trends?
I think the question you're asking is far broader than purpose, but I think the general concept of a collective interest, a stable collective interest, is a powerful one. Corporations, like societies, have to avoid fracturing. They have to be cohesive, and I think a purpose can help with that cohesion. And we have very good reasons for having a purpose at the level of a society, of course. The two specific topics which were dominating Davos conversation this year were multi-stakeholder capitalism, making capitalism work for stakeholders other than shareholders, and the other one was global warming. Global warming is such a colossal problem that it requires coordinated effort across countries, across governments, and at all levels of society. So we really do need a common interest. Now we have one, right? We've got the common enemy of, if we don't do it, we'll have flooding and all sorts of other effects which will be economically and socially extremely disruptive. So what we need now is not just the declaration of intent, not just the urgency from the problem. We actually need collective mobilization and collective action, which is, I think, actually, it's not global warming, because we understand a lot about the problem and the solutions. The real central problem of the planet right now is collective mobilization and collective action. The hopeful thing is that mankind has actually done that before with some very tricky problems.
Fascinating conversation. Martin Reeves, thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean.
And that's the Social Purpose Exchange. This program also exists as a podcast, so we invite you to check it out wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Sean Mallon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.